So thank you so much for joining. I'm really looking forward to tonight's event for many different reasons. I'm sure you are as well. So I'm Nabil, I'll be your host for the evening. I'll just give a very quick introduction to our Meetup group before I progress with the other introductions. So Essence for Agility, the Meetup group, we are a community that started at the beginning of this year, so we're almost a year old. We started with the aim to explore Essence, which is a standard that describes all the practices within agile methods in a way that better enables us to pick the right set of practices to suit our context, regardless of which method they belong to. So they very much focus on the practices, because you could say a method is merely a composition of practices. So it helps free those practices from the method prison, as some of us say. We also naturally explore other topics on agile, such as obviously this event is not purely focused on Essence. We're just exploring topics to give you audience a fine time. So tonight I am really privileged to host an incredible trio of speakers. In no particular order, we have Mr. Ian Spence, who has worked with Dr. Ivar Jacobson, the creator of use cases, for more than 15 years. And he's also developed the use case idea to be a really good practice for SAFe. So you could say he's got a fair bit of experience in that area. Up next, we have Mr. Bernie Clark, who has much experience in successfully applying use cases and user stories in big banks, perhaps even small ones too, who knows? Hopefully we'll find out. And last but not least, our special guest tonight, and I have to admit a personal favorite of mine because his blogging and newsletters have helped me greatly over the years, Mr. Mike Cohn, who has naturally done much to progress user stories over the years. And if this all wasn't good enough for you, we also have Dr. Ivar Jacobson with us, who is not only the creator of use cases, but he will also be giving a short introduction to the theme of tonight's event. And he may also, if we're lucky, join in the conversation at certain points. We will wait and see. So those are my intros out of the way. I'd ask that all of you keep your microphones muted to minimize disturbance. We'll hopefully have time for your questions at the end. I'm essentially going to ask, a set of questions to our panelists, and then afterwards we'll get to any burning questions that you might have. But first, let's hand over to Ivar to hear his intro to the event.
Hello, everybody. This is a dream meetup. Since there is so much confusion regarding use cases and user stories, it has been a dream of mine for a long time to set up a discussion on these two subjects, attracting so much interest in the industry. Are they competing or complementary? Can they support one another? I did a Google search on the two terms and found that they both get millions of hits. Of course, these numbers have to be understood in a smart way. The reason that use cases has so many hits is that it has become a normal English word. It's used to talk about what self-driving cars, what internet does, what big data should do. Personally, I believe that in development, they are used at the same level. Potentially user stories are even more used. Now we are going to listen to very interesting discussion. On one side of the table, we have Mike Cohn, a father of user stories. And on the other side, we have Ian Spence, who more than anyone else has contributed to the development of use cases. And in the middle, we have Bernie Clark, who has worked with both in large organizations introducing agile. What can go wrong? Back to you, Nabil.
Well, let's find out what can go wrong.
Let's do it.
Fail fast, right? Or learn fast.
Nothing can go wrong.
Okay, so before I get into my questions, I just wanted to give each panelist a quick opportunity to give their own introduction from their perspective, both to give you guys a flavor of who they are and maybe even the experience they have with user stories and use cases. So why don't we hear from Mr. Mike Cohn first?
Great, thank you, Nabil.
My background is as a programmer, worked my way up through management, CTO type of stuff. These days, for the last 20 years or so, I've run my own company, helping people kind of get agile, but really what I'm focused on is amazing products, helping teams become amazing. And I'm known as a Scrum guy, which is okay, I don't mind that. But the things that I'm most known for actually come from other processes, extreme programming in particular, which used user stories and story points for estimating. And those are the two things I speak and write about, consult about the most frequently. So I'm kind of on the user story side of this, but I started out very much as a use case guy when I first read about them in Ivar's book. And the challenge that I had with use cases is that they're great, but they're complicated. And when I've worked with clients have had a really hard time being successful with that because they have to understand extensions and secondary actors and what is even a primary actor and main success scenarios, alternatives, and it gets very complicated for them. And clients often end up just kind of giving up. And so I think of it as kind of like a souffle. I've been trying to learn how to cook during the pandemic, and making a souffle is tough. I have to beat the egg whites just the right amount, but if I do it perfectly, it's great. Can't beat that meal. But I often fail and end up just kind of recooking something else quickly for dinner. And so I find user stories much easier when I go to my clients. So I love use cases. And I've probably given away more copies of Ian's book on use cases than I ever have of my own book back when I was trying to get clients to be successful. Because when I couldn't get them to understand it, I'd either give them Alistair Coburn's Writing Effective Use Cases, or a couple years later when Ian's book came out, which was much better because it didn't get as templated. And so I'm a big fan of them, but they often run into problems, which is where I end up using user stories instead.
It was a lovely introduction. Thank you so much, Mike. Great to hear all of that. Bernie, why don't we hear a few words from you next?
Okay, thank you. And Bernie Clark, thanks, Nabil, for organizing this. You do a fantastic job. I love it. And honored to be in this sandwich here between these luminaries. You know, I don't have books and titles to my name, but like you, Mike, I started out as a programmer in 1980. My goodness, long time ago. And I ended up as a Scaled Agile coach. And so what happened in between is in 1996, I got exposed to use cases and the unified process and UML. And I loved it. I glommed right onto it. And I loved the structure of it, and it made sense to me. So a lot of my early experience is really use case based. And I couldn't agree with you more of how, you know, technically how difficult use cases can be. They're very complicated, and if done right, they're great. But it's difficult to get them right. I agree. So I think we'll talk about it when I talk about use case 2.0, but I think one of the problems with use cases is they grew up in a world where organizations were still very siloed. And Agile has kind of tried to take everybody out of that silo mentality. But once you're in that silo mentality, you end up with one group doing the use cases and having to sign them off in detail and freeze them so that the architects can look at them. And then you're off to the races. You know, you've got this very complicated, arcane thing that doesn't lead to collaboration and agility. So that really needed to be undone and thought about. And when Agile came along, as it always does, it puts the big questions up right in your face, and the challenges are right in your face. And so I think that use cases, unless they're really well understood and carefully managed in the way they were originally intended, by the way, they can seem to be too heavy. So I'm hoping that in this conversation today, we'll look at what are the good things about using use cases in a business context and traceability, and what are the great things about user stories and their collaborative nature and their agility. So with a mind to finding, what are good essential practices that people could think about so they can make their own decisions. So it's not one or the other. It's like, what are the qualities here that we should be looking for? So that's what I'm hoping we get done today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bernie. That was really interesting. Ian Spence, last but not least, let's hear from you.
Hi, so I'm Ian Spence. I started as a programmer, like these other gentlemen, a long time ago. I think they recently turned off the last piece of major software I wrote after 17 years, untouched. All the comms for a major UK bank. So I was a software engineer. Then I got into Java. I loved, no, Smalltalk. I loved Smalltalk. Smalltalk was wonderful. And through Smalltalk, I got into OO. Through object orientation, I ended up working for Rational Software, where I came across the objective process, use cases, and all of those things. And while I was at Rational, people were struggling to understand use cases. Ivar's book, Object-Oriented Software Engineering, fabulous book, but you had to cram everything in there, didn't you, Ivar? It wasn't enough to have use cases. We needed database, and everything was in there. And there wasn't really a good guide to use cases. I mean, Alistair had done one, but I wasn't that fond of it. So with a colleague at Rational, Kurt Bittner, we wrote about use case modeling in the early 2000s. And this is when we were doing iterative, but agile hadn't really entered my consciousness then. But as we started to see agility coming along, we started to do more work, still using use cases, and but adopting many of the ideas from agility. So, you know, the 3 C's: card, conversation, confirmation. The best way to think of a use case is the context for holding conversations. Rather than talk about the whole thing, you could talk about one of the use cases. So as we started to explore agile, one of the things, certainly Kurt, me and some other people at IGI, we involved an agile simulation. And we started with a use case model, just actors in use cases. And then we would run a Scrum simulation. And we would allow people either to just create user stories within the scope of the use case. And that works very well. When I was on, Mike taught me Scrum a long time ago. Right? And when we had the challenge on the course to come up with some user stories, me and my colleague, we sketched out some use cases and then came up with user stories based on them. So you can take the use cases just as a frame of reference so that your conversations have more focus. Alongside this, we started to think we need to update use cases. People, it's great that the practice is scalable, but everyone goes too far. Right? You can have very lightweight use cases, essential use cases, outlines. You can use the things Mike talked about, like include and extend. But as we say, as I always say on the use case courses, you include and extend are like swearing. It's not big, it's not clever, and it's only effective if you use it occasionally to make a point. Right? If you use it all the time, just like swearing, no one will listen to you anymore. And so we've been using and mixing and matching. But one thing we did do was use case 2.0, which is use case driven development for agility. This allows you to slice up use cases to create backlog items that work in the same way as user stories. But you can do, like I say, the illustrative use cases where the use case is just a way to collect related user stories together and show you what's going on. And the biggest power we've seen, as Nabil said, I recently created a course, Use Cases for Agile at Scale. Because when you get to big systems, really big systems, like for example, and if you know me, you know what I'm going to talk about, square kilometre array. Biggest science facility man, well, when it's built, it'll be the biggest science facility man's ever built. Huge radio telescope, it's in Wikipedia. I recommend you look it up. It's got hundreds of thousands dishes in the South African desert, hundreds of thousands of antennae in the Australian desert. It's going to let us see things about the universe we've never seen before, and it will generate more data every year than the entire internet did in 2016. Right? They're building supercomputers for this, and they're using Agile to build it. And the teams are using Agile, and they're using SAFe. They have features, they have user stories, but they need to uncover the solution intent. Right? What is this thing? So they have built a use case model for what this observatory, 2 telescopes, is going to do as a whole, to give context for the work that those teams are doing, to allow the architectural discussions about the subsystems. There's going to be hundreds and hundreds of people working on this in parallel. So the teams are doing user stories, but use cases is giving them that solution intent, that overview of what it actually does, what science it's going to do, and allow them to do the scientist's journey with them. So I've been using them for a long time now, still good stuff. And, they are, you can pick one or the other, or you can mix and match and use them together.
Fascinating. Really looking forward to that observatory, or learning more about it at least. Thank you so much, Ian. Amazing introduction. So, guys, I'm going to ask a few questions now that I have prepared earlier. And then after I'm done, I'll go to the audience for some questions. So let's start off. Ian, you touched on this already, use case 2.0. Bernie, this one's for you though. Given you have extensive experience with use cases, perhaps you could describe use case 2.0 for us a little bit to inform the audience.
Sure, yeah. So I'm going to assume there's a basic knowledge about use cases, but please don't be offended if I go over stuff that you've seen before. So I think I have share capability. Is that fair? Have I got that? I can share my screen with you.
Yep, you should be able to.
There we go.
Can you see that?
Yep.
Good. So use case originals and 2.0 always have been the hub of software development. So it's not just about getting the requirements. It is about having a structure within which you can gather the requirements. As Ian said, you can start small, and as you have conversations, you have a place to put the requirements. And the use cases then can be used for all kinds of aspects of your software development. As you can see here, we can look at architectural ramifications, look for technical risk. We can look for reuse opportunities. And we can actually plan our development based on value delivery, based around the use cases. So it's not just a way to capture requirements. It's actually use case driven development, which I always found so attractive. And a term I'm going to use here is a slice. And just like when we do agile development, we like to drive a slice. We like to deliver a story that is complete and actually provides some functionality. With our use cases, we like to slice through the whole system and develop and deliver a package of functionality that has value. So in that regard, similar types of idea. Now, originally, use cases, if we look at the structure of a use case, let's just scroll down here. We can have conversations to work out what our use cases are. And because use cases grew up as part of the unified modeling language, there was a visual way to say, well, what use cases are we interested in? And those of your agile people there who are you're interested in design and user-based development, design-centric, the good news is we do it by finding the actors. We find out who's going to use the system and what are they going to do. Very much like you could say, oh, these look like a user story. As a calling subscriber, I want to place a local call so I can talk to somebody. So again, not that very different in concept, in that we use it, it's user-centric, and we find out who's going to use the system and what are they going to use it for. And this helps us scope out what's in and what's out. We haven't written any big documents. We've had a discussion. These could be sticky notes on a wall. And this has always been the same for use cases since they were invented. Now, the problem is that when we actually start looking at our use case, we do want to describe what has got to happen in our use case. We do want to describe the responsibilities of the person using the system, we call them the actor, and what the system is going to do. And in this regard, we get a little bit more detailed than the user story might have. We're already kind of entering the conversation a little bit at this point. But we are creating an outline of the system. And it's important for us to do that because we need to know what these flows are, the basic flow that runs right through the system here, and any alternatives that can happen. And are we interested in these alternatives? Do we care about these alternatives? Are they of value? Are they of technical risk? And without this view of the use case and having this discussion, we can't really easily get to deciding what we're going to implement through our backlog. So the thing with use case 2.0, it's very explicit about how we can look at these different flows and divide up the flows or bits of flows into implementable stuff. In the old days, I used to teach Scrum with use cases. And what we would do is just derive the stories from the basic flow would be a story, and then each alternative flow would be a story. But there's a problem there because the basic flow can be quite big. You might not want to do all of the basic flow. You can't get it done in one spike or in one sprint, or you can't get an alternative flow done in one sprint. So you need a mechanism by which you can actually look at the use case and its structure and decide what slices you're actually going to implement. And that's what use case 2.0 does. It says, okay, we've got the structure of the use case, but how are we going to implement this use case? And so with our use cases, and I'll show you another picture about slices in a minute, you can imagine that a use case is made up of different slices. And you can decide, first increment, we're just going to implement the first slice. That slice is going to take elements of one or more flows, and more importantly, it's going to have test cases associated with it. So it's very much like acceptance criteria. Very unambiguous, clear test cases that go with that slice. So you can see that the slice is very much looking like a user story here. In fact, as Ian said, having got the structure here, you could say your slice, you could write it as a user story.
Well,
and in fact, you could say, as a so-and-so, I want a so-and-so, so I can. Yeah.
Can I just interject for a moment?
Yeah, please, Ian. Yeah.
It's kind of come up in the chat as well. The big problem with use cases, they don't make good backlog items. No, they just don't make. You don't want to deliver your system use case by use case, because to get a minimum viable product or minimum marketable release, you probably need the basic flow and some alternatives for the use cases. So they just don't make good backlog items. So slicing is one way to create backlog items, as Bernie says, directly from a use case. The other way is to cut to the chase, and from that outline for each step in a basic flow, as a I want so that, for each alternative, as I want so that, and then you can let the stories flow. Right, and they give you that context, and you can treat each use case as a story map as well, which Bernie may touch on. I don't know what you think, Mike. Have you used them together?
Oh, absolutely. I have a fair number of clients when they first want to become agile, they're using use cases already, and they decide to go agile. The thing that I've seen, though, this is back to my point earlier about use cases just being harder. A lot of applications don't need this level of complexity. And so the clients that I tend to work with use use cases, and then within a year of doing exactly what we're describing here, of splitting out the stories from within the use case as an overall grouping mechanism, they end up just going to stories, and they drop the use case aspect of that. Probably that's a good thing for many of the companies that I've seen that at. A few where the systems were huge, that might have been better to keep the use cases as that overall, somebody talked about context earlier, because if you have a lot of stories, it is hard to see the context of how those stories fit together. And you can do that with as simple as Bernie's picture up there of interacting with the bank, or a visual diagram, right? That helps provide more context. But when we go to short iterations and break things down, and we're not looking all that far ahead, a lot of times that's not needed. If it is, totally fine going to this level of detail, but I'd want to make sure that was necessary. I'm a big fan of being lazy and not doing things unless it's really going to add value.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, Mike. It's horses for courses. You know, we want to less is more. You know, there are situations where I've worked with a medical devices company, and I know Jeff Hallett's on the call here today, where regulatory needs. You have to be able to version these things, and you have to be able to show your intent of what the system's going to do. Mm-hmm. So in some cases, yeah, you know, you've really got to have the detail. But where you can do less, and you're not forced into that situation, sure, go on a voyage of discovery.
Well, and Jeff commented along those lines in the chat, and I agree.
Yeah.
One of the things that I look at, there's a couple big differences between stories and use cases to me, and one is the intended use. User stories are not meant to be part of a system's permanent record, right?
Yeah.
They exist, and maybe we keep the file around, but we never look at it again. It's not really useful for most situations. If that stuff really needs to persist, use cases can be good as that collecting mechanism. And the other thing that you're getting at, which was what drove me to user stories so early on, after really trying to get successful with use cases, was the intended size. I do not know the current debate in the use case world, but when I was writing my user story book, the big debate I'd go in forums was, should a use case be a day or should it be a year or 10 years? Right? That was the literal debate back then. And in user stories, the debate is, should it be hours or days, right? And so there's this huge magnitude difference, which is why we don't look at it and say we can plan a project with use cases. They're just too big. And again, that's outdated thinking. I'm sure they've gotten smaller over the years, but that was literally the debate many years ago. I remember a conversation with Grady Booch where I talked about a system. I described a system to him. I said, how many use cases would you have? And he said, 15. And this was about 150 person year project. And he said they'd have 15 use cases. Assume he didn't hear me properly, multiply it by 10, 150 use cases, right? That's not a lot. Those are pretty big for managing the project with them that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point, Mike. I'll jump in really quick. And yeah, this is Jeff. Bernie just mentioned me. We worked together at a fairly large medical systems company a number of years ago. And yeah, we came to the same conclusion pretty quickly that, to especially meet a lot of the regulatory requirements that we were being asked to meet in terms of design control and things like that. I mean, use cases and other modeling approaches, we did use UML quite a bit, gave us a way to express the system, in a way that we could do user experience and risk management and change control and all those good things, maintaining that bigger picture, that bigger context. And then we used, features and stories and so on to direct the development and realization of that solution. So we could, bottom out risk early, test hypotheses early, drive our integration, get user feedback, and then iterate, on the use cases and other modeling elements as the solution evolved. And that was very successful for us.
That sounds perfect.
Yeah. Thanks, Jeff. Mike, I think you've raised what I would put down as one of the questions of the day here, is how do we actually capture and record our requirements? And do we need to? So I think that's important. I think if we do need to capture and if I'm doing user stories and I have a conversation, I don't want to put those requirements in a user story in Jira. Not going to happen, never, right? Because it's going to go away, it's going to get lost. If I don't have use cases, what kind of formal structure am I using? Do I put them under customer journey headings? Am I capturing story maps somewhere? Am I saying, I can do it all through test driven? I can do Gherkin and I can describe it all using Gherkin. What is our approach? I guess this is an essential quality as an organization. If we need to capture our requirements, where are we going to put them and how are we going to organize them and version them? Whether it's use cases or whatever, I think that's a challenge that needs to be addressed. So, for me, that's one of those issues. And I think the other one is that when we're doing slices and stories, these are a temporal view. They're a build view of the system. We've decided right now we think these parts are important. We're going to build these things, and they, you can have a slice that is a few days, but the actual use case that it lives within might take much longer to develop. But those things are going to go away, and as you said, they don't persist. So user stories are not requirements. Use case slices are not requirements. The use cases are a repository for the requirements, and they also give you a context within the business, because we can have system use cases and higher level business use cases, yada, yada, yada. But
talk about that. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I guess, my 3 sentences or less has become 10 sentences.
I wanted to add one thing when they're describing
go.
there, because you're talking about user stories, use cases, not necessarily the requirements. The way I talk about user stories is absolutely what you just said. They are not the requirements. I talk about a user story as being a pointer to a requirement. And it just means, I mean, it could be a help about dialogue on some silly system, right? It's a pointer to a requirement. Go talk to somebody and say, what do you want on the copyright screen, right? Something more involved, it's going to be it could be a diagram, it could be a sketched out user interface, it could be a use case that describes something. It could be a calculation done in MATLAB, do the calculation this way, but it's a pointer to a requirement. And then a lot of requirements, depends on the system, but a lot of requirements are easily enough talked about, right? Others do need to be written, others need to be 3 weeks of meetings, right? But a user story points to that requirement in whatever form it exists.
Yeah, and I think and you know that, but I think I've seen it. I've seen customers trying to cram all their requirements into Jira, into a story, and I'm like, no, and I need to send them to you, Mike.
There's a fundamental problem with what most people think of as requirements. They just aren't. Most of them are design decisions. I mean, the SKA, the world's biggest telescope, doesn't have that many use cases, and it doesn't have that many requirements. But there's a hell of a lot of complexity. There's a lot of stuff to go on. There's going to be a lot of user stories. But at the top level, the use case model, it doesn't do much. You point it at, you collect radio waves, you do science with them.
Do science, there's the requirement.
Do science, yeah.
Well, I mean, there's a couple of scientific related use cases. Right? But you don't necessarily, complexity isn't necessary, but look right there, originally they were going to have like 1, 2, 3, 5 levels of requirements, but the things at level 5 aren't requirements, they're design decisions about what components should do. Nobody was asking for that in the first place.
Years ago, somebody was trying to make desirements the word, right? We wouldn't call them requirements, we call them desirements. I don't even know if that's a real word, but it just bugged me, right? It's so, but that was
and again, building on some of the experience we talked about before, Bernie and I ran into this too, is, typically when we talk about the big upfront thing, the trap, just as you said, Ian, is people start confusing design decisions with initial needs and requirements. And so the big upfront, stops focus, somewhere it stops being about the need and starts being about what we're going to build. And then you've fallen into the trap, the sticky tar baby of things being done too early, too upfront. Yeah.
Well, I always like to assert that never in the history of the world, if you had 3 months, you gave people 3 months to do requirements, never in the history of the world have they come in after 1 month and gone, found the last one today, Mike, we got them all. No, if they happen by chance to have found all the requirements in 1 month, they'll make stuff up for the next 2 months, right? Because it's not a boundable thing. A use case model does give you a bound. And the thing I think Bernie was going to talk, the best thing about them is they help you manage your test cases. Right. So if you have the use case, you do the stories, you produce test cases. If you can link those up, you can manage all of those hundreds of thousands of test cases you'll get through your many years of sprinting. And that can be incredibly powerful on these big systems. How do you work out which regressions to do? I know we like to say you can automate them all, but I had a customer, they're building cranes. They can't, and if they actually want to run the thing, they need to take over a dockyard. It's not, not going to happen.
Nabil, looks like you're trying to get in there.
I didn't want to interrupt the fascinating conversation. I just wanted to ask Ian, because I know he's adapted use cases for agile at scale. I just wanted to ask if he could tell us a bit more about that, perhaps.
Well, what it is, use cases are very, very useful. And if you look at all the things that were in use case driven development initially, the most popular one was having some use cases, right? They may be illustrative, so you knock them up at the beginning and then you throw them away, right? In the whole thing with user stories, if you're starting from scratch, I would always have a use case model. If I'm intercepting a product and team who have no idea what they have no permanent record, they don't know what their requirements are, they're making small changes, then why go and try and recover that impossibly recoverable thing? Get on with the user stories, maybe find a few use cases. So use cases are really useful, particularly when you need that permanent record that Mike and Bernie will talk about. In some industries, you have to have traceability from code up to some kind of requirement specification. Mike, you recently wrote a blog about fixed price and how you can be agile with fixed price. Well, if you do have to get a signed off requirement spec, if you do it in use cases, you'll be able to slice it up and have user stories when you're developing it. But you'd only do that full spec because you need it to get the money out of the customer or whatever the logic is. So what we found is that there was this hole in a lot, certainly agile at scale, big things like the SKA. I was working again with a medical company running experiments in labs and coordinating all of these different things. So there's a hole there, but you've got to make a decision. Do you want illustrative use cases? So a use case model that gives you a context for conversations that you can show people, but you're not really going to keep it up to date. It's going to help you, get off that starting point, give you more context. And it can really help you with things like pruning the product tree. The use cases of the branches, have we done any stories and features over here, or are they all over there? That's great. So I'd call that just illustrative use cases. Then you've got the full-on use case driven development where you drive the slices, you do the use case realizations, you find all your flows, you keep your documentation up to date. And in between that is something I would call use case enabled software development, where you use the use cases as part of your permanent record, but basically as a living story map.
Yep.
Right? And so you sketch out your flow, you can turn each step of your flow into a user story. Alternative flows become bundles of user stories, but you can use the use case to build up what you've got and what's in place. But you don't go beyond outlining the use case, and it's very fluid. You might find new alternative flows and things at any point in time. So that's not using them to drive, but that's using them to enable understanding the big picture. And the thing they share, the thing most popular, people love, as Ivar said, use case has entered the English language. All right. Not everyone who talks about use cases has a model to illustrate their use cases, but the picture is the second, the high level picture is the second most popular bit, having the use case model. And it's very useful, particularly at scale when you're doing these really big things. Right? What is our intent? Is this in or out of scope? So it allows you to do scope management at a higher level. I know that the use cases may take years, Mo, but the world's biggest telescope is going to take at least 7 years to build it. Right? 100,000 antenna in the Australian desert is going to be quite challenging, but all the rest of it. So they need something they can focus on so they don't drift away from their original intent.
I don't think that's surprising at all. I think there are products that just scream out for use cases, and then there are going to be other products that scream out, just use a user story. Let's suppose you're rewriting Minesweeper for Windows, right? I don't need a use case model to rewrite Minesweeper, right? And so those aren't very interesting to me. What I'm interested is kind of the vast middle area where I might use a little use cases, or maybe I use a lot of use cases on the other end. What are the guidelines for somebody to choose? Is it, okay, I'm not building Minesweeper, I'm building something bigger. Is it worth it for me adding use cases into what I do? Or can I get by a lot easier just using user stories, maybe make a few mistakes, but I've saved time and I can recover from those mistakes, right? And so the extreme is not very interesting. It's where do we merge the two and to what extent? That's where I'm interested.
Start small and evolve. Yeah.
Start small. Add the use cases if you need it, or if you know you're going to need the use cases for context, maybe start there, but only use it for that context, and then kind of drive it with the stories that you've pulled from your context.
So so many agile teams primarily use user stories to manage what they have to do. Essentially, it could be the placeholder for a conversation to get the requirement, as we've discussed. Mike, I'm interested to hear your opinion about if you generally, in a sort of typical Teams environment, if we can, imagine one, do you think that the user story practice is sufficient for, the majority of use cases, if you will, for a development environment? Or do you think there are limitations or gaps with only using user stories? If so, do you think other techniques like customer journey mapping or story mapping should be used to complement them? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'll give you a fairly brief answer, but I want to start with a detour first. Somebody mentioned risk earlier. It's come up a couple of times. And when I was kind of classically trained to run projects traditional ways, and very much bothered me that in Agile, we don't really do any formal risk management. And so in a lot of teams I work with, we will create a risk census. How likely is the risk to happen? How bad is the impact? All that type of stuff. And it bothered me that a lot of teams don't want to do that until I started to realize, when we go to short 2-week iterations, which is the most common, we go to 2-week iterations, a lot of risk goes away because we're going to either know it or not in 2 weeks. I'm not saying all risks, so don't criticize extreme ones that need to be focused on. But a lot of risk goes away when we shrink things down. And I think it's the same when we work with the requirements. We don't need as big a picture when we shrink it down. And so I think a lot of systems user stories are sufficient. Most of the systems that I encounter. Now, we have to be careful here because we're all going to have some form of selection bias, right? Somebody doesn't come to me if they're doing something that's absolutely all about use cases, right? They're going to come to me with a story-based type system. So those are what I see, right? I definitely see use cases, but not very much. And so I do think it's sufficient for a lot of systems, and it's because we shrink it down to the 2-week iterations. And in many cases, having a wiki that documents everything we did, each user story is a wiki page, that ends up being sufficient for the documentation on a lot of systems, not on a 7-year a telescope array, not on a medically regulated space shuttle, but for a lot of projects, I do think it's sufficient to have that level of documentation.
Awesome. Bernie and Ian, what do you think about that? Do you agree with Mike's thoughts?
I think it really is a question of horses for courses. I wouldn't want to force use case practice on somebody that's not going to give them value. You really need to find, and it doesn't have to be use cases or user stories even. There could be something we haven't even thought about here, but it's a practice that meets their needs. And clearly agile is going to inform us as to what a good practice is versus not good practices. But yeah, I can see where Mike's coming from with that entirely. Ian?
Great.
Yes, a lot of it. I mean, you're not going to get over the personal preference. I mean, I was at a large organization and I gave a talk about agile, and some people looking rather crestfallen came up to talk to me, and they said, the Agile Center of Excellence has told us that if we do use cases, we can't be agile. Right? Now, all our numbers show we're one of the best teams in the entire bank, but we can't be agile because we're doing use cases and not user stories. So you're always going to get a bit of personal preference in there. Use cases, the use case model, some illustrative use cases fill a real need, particularly when the people doing the development don't necessarily understand very well what they're building, and it's not that experimental going on. But the danger with use cases is because you can turn up the heat, you can do formal requirement specs, people get lured in. They get lured in. It's like, oh, maybe we should go the next bit, even when it's what's for them. Mm-hmm. So there is a danger of getting carried away with use cases that you don't find with user stories. And that's the beauty of the user story technique, is it keeps you focused on quick, fast iterations. Yeah. So it's about, is it going to help you? And do you need that permanent record or not? Right.
And I think with the use cases, though, the danger is that it becomes a bit arcane, when it's fully blown. Not many people find them accessible to have the conversation, so you lose the benefit of the collaborative.
I think you see this is where we hit some of the issues. If no one understands your use cases, they're rubbish.
They're not.
They're not worth the paper they're printed on. Then you shouldn't have done it. So they should.
Well, maybe
be
it's
accessible.
The techniques.
They should be open and accessible, and you look in them, and you should be able to summarize them on a page because you hide the detail, right? Mm. But sometimes you're doing things where you're not in a position to have conversations with the users and the stakeholders. They're only available once a year. Mm-hmm. So then, so use cases help you if you need to write more stuff down. But it's much beneficial if you don't, placeholders for conversations. And if your model doesn't make sense to people, you've gone too far. I have seen use case models they did experiments on spiders. They gave them various kinds of drugs and looked at the webs Some of these use case models were done by the people on the strongest psychedelic amphetamines available to spiders, right? Crazy, lots of like, horrible things. And that's where it goes wrong. When people say, keep it simple, what are the goals of the users? And if they get to building things quickly, okay, what would be the first story in this use case? Or what would be the first slice? Then you'll probably be okay.
Yeah, so that might be another one of these essential qualities, that we need to think about. If we're thinking about how are we going to do it, we need to make sure that it meets the needs that you were just talking about, Ian.
Yeah. And you said something interesting where you said, I'm going to paraphrase this, hopefully I get it right, but that use cases, one of the risks there is that we go overboard. And I like that in the sense that I agree with that, but the risk with user stories, is we go underboard, right?
Underboard, yeah.
Right. So we have to be aware of that risk. And I think to some extent, that's, again, back to where I'm interested in like what advice for how do we have people pick and which mix. If you're on a team that tends to overcomplicate things, that might be a time to skew towards stories a little bit more. If you're on a team that doesn't do enough thinking, and we had in the chat people talking about my team doesn't want to do any documentation at all, that might be a time to skew more towards use cases to fight that natural tendency within the team. And so I think that's an important distinction. Each one can lead to an exactly opposite problem.
That's really interesting. Yeah. So when would you actually recommend that teams use use case 2.0? Are there scenarios in, for example, your recent experience that you've thought, okay, this is a scenario where it's just better suited to use use case 2.0 versus user stories? Perhaps Bernie, you could share with us.
Yeah, I think for me, it's because I'm mostly dealing with, quite large, complicated systems, banks and medical devices, and have been. Infrequently have I worked with smaller outfits or small teams. There was a case in San Francisco, a ticket company, shall we say, where safe scaled agile was kind of a bit of a threat to them. And they weren't sure about it. So we had more of a user story approach and not use cases. And so more classic agile evolutionary approach. But generally, because for me, use case 2.0 solves the agile problem. I want to, if I get like 3 minutes, I'd like to run through a slide that shows you how. But I end up with user stories within the context of use cases. So you get the best of both worlds. So I always think use case 2.0, if it's not an exploratory effort and the company already has an established framework of use cases, then I'm right in there with 2.0. So probably best if I shut up at that point, but Ian's probably got more experience in that regard.
The use case 2.0 sweet spot, as specified, so this is the full-on use case driven development, is for situations where you do need to do upfront requirements because of contractual, legal, or regulatory circumstances, right? So where the people who are going to be building the system and the people who are going to be using the system, neither of them actually know what the system is supposed to do, right? Because often the system is there to help people who don't know what they're doing do things. So the users may not actually be the right thing. So restricted access to subject matter experts, systems with a lot of hidden complexity, right? Where on the outside it's very simple, but inside it's really, really complicated, those sorts of things. Also the life cycle. If it's brand new, then I would always start by sketching out a use case model because that helps me. And then based on the kind of things we've discussed with Mike, we would decide how much we want to turn up the heat on that. Is that just to get us through, a use case model in a business case, everyone can see the solution intent. Yeah. And the question, do you need that permanent record? So there's a number of levers that you're playing around with. Most people, though, traditionally have over-egged their cake. They work in organizations where the people who are doing compliance have totally forgotten what their mission is, right? They think that process compliance means writing a process down at the beginning and following it to the letter, not recording what you actually did, right? Yeah. So you need to play around, talk to people, see what works, see what's helping. And use cases and user stories mix very well Use case 2.0 is bringing in more traceability, more of the use case analysis, the realization, and that kind of stuff, which can be useful in some of those situations I was talking about.
Yep.
Thank you so much for the answers. Very insightful. My next question for you guys is use cases aren't just limited to system use cases, as I think we've touched on earlier. Bernie, you mentioned a couple of different examples. There are also business use cases, which are, you could say, is very similar to value streams. A similar line of thought is that a practice is a use case for a method. What are your thoughts on whether use cases are actually a general pattern applicable as business use cases to represent value streams and as use cases of a method to represent practices?
I think
I'm going to defer to Ian here, but I do have an answer for you. But I can see Ian is chomping at the bit.
I want to say,
Champing at the bit.
The first thing we have to watch out for is describing one thing we don't understand in terms of another thing we don't understand. I've been on many courses where someone has said, well, use stories, they're like use cases. And it's like, that doesn't help me. I don't know what they are either. Right? Value streams is a subject very near and dear to my heart, but also you have to be very careful with that. Use cases can be useful to describe anything that has a boundary in terms of the goals and its purpose. So you can do systems of systems, business as anything treated like a system. You could do a use case model, and as you noted, they can be, if you do them for the business, they can be very helpful in finding your customer journeys, or if you are in the safe world and you're looking for these development value streams and these operational value streams we like to talk about, then you could use a use case model to model them. But one is the real thing and one is a model. So that's where, and
Mike, did you want to say something?
Thinking about use cases outside of software systems, I had to think about that. And my initial thought was like, I don't know if that would work as well, because the client that I was thinking about they operate summer camps for little kids. And so there's some software to do that, but they're actually using Agile to manage their summer camps. And so my initial thought was, I don't see how it would fit, but I can see how it would fit. I had to think about it, but I can see that fitting there. But it's a little bit back to my earlier point about they're more complicated, and I'm not sure that in that domain where the people running it are not as technical, I'm not sure they would do as well with use cases. And if we look at the things where use cases were necessary, things like traceability and complexity, large systems, then I don't see they'd add any value over a user story there. So I think they could apply, but I think that's not kind of their sweet spot.
So my response to it, when I learned Unified Process, I was all over the hierarchy, the layering that is offered in UML in terms of a business use case model is saying, what are the cases of use of a business? So, it's a business use case. It's not something written by the business. It's what is the case of use of a business. And as Ian said, if you determine what those cases of use are, you can determine as a business, we do these things, or we offer these things to our customers, or we don't. Now, having done that, you then move into this thing called business use case realizations or operational value streams that say, how do we actually provide that thing to the customer? And that's where you get competitive advantage as a business. You work out the steps and things you're going to do to satisfy that business use case for your customer. And during that, there are steps in there that you say, well, we need a computer system to help us do this. So you come up with system use cases, and maybe your internal workers during that operational stream use those system use cases. But maybe you see an opportunity and say, well, let's get rid of all those internal workers and give the responsibility to the customer. So the business use case, I want to get money out the bank, becomes a system use case of withdrawing cash from an ATM. And it's all done, you've fired all you don't need a building anymore. You don't need people to work. So the point about using use cases at a business level and deriving it and looking at the value, the realizations or the value streams could be very powerful. But as Ian has pointed out to me in the past, it's fewer people are interested in doing that because there are fewer people available to do that analysis, or need to do it. And the sweet spot is lower down in actually developing the systems. Just one more thing on that. Many places I've worked at, people insist on system use cases being technical use cases. They call them technical use cases, and they fall into the trap that Jeff said. They start designing, they put the solution in there. They're not. System use cases are cases of use of a system and should explain the what, not the how. And if you want to get into the how, then you're into the design. That's the realization of the system use case.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for the answers. Great conversation so far. I'm actually out of questions, but Bernie, I know you were keen to share a couple slides with us, which you promised.
Are we finishing at the top of the hour, or?
No. So there's still some audience Q&A.
Okay, good.
Can I share something very quickly?
Go for it.
I did this once before. Next week, this is a side thing. This is an essence thing. Apologies, Mike. Next week, we're running a Better Scrum with Essence course. And we have a few places could be available. If you would like to email me, maybe get you a free place. So I'll put my email address in there. Don't let it distract you from this fine conversation, but be quick if you want to get in.
What a lovely offer. Okay. Okay, guys, Bernie, okay, we've only got about 10 minutes left, so you have to promise me that you'll only take
2 minutes.
2 minutes, and then we'll have a quick few questions from the audience, and then we can wrap up. Thank you.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so imagine you're Jane and you're on the way to work and you come up with a great idea. And you get into work and you say, I've got this fantastic idea. I'm going to put it in the world of SAFe, Scaled Agile Framework. I'm going to stick this idea in an epic and we're going to work on this. So when you stick the idea in the epic, actually what you're doing is implying that there's a part of the system that you're going to change. And let's imagine this box represents all the things that your company can do. And you say, we're going to change this bit. We're going to be better here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this information into an epic in Agile Central or whatever tool you're going to use. And I'm going to list a bunch of features that I think I'd like. Now, if we stop at that point, instead of going and putting stories into Jira that map to these features, we then start looking at what this thing is, and we analyze our flow, right, of the things that are in here. And in our analysis, we identify these potential use cases. I'm rushing here, but now I don't want to write these use cases in detail, but what I do want to do is get some bulleted outlines and maybe some activity diagrams around these so I can understand them and have conversations about them. And also during that process, I'm going to find things called non-functional requirements. I'm going to find business rules that are linked to these things. So I'm still very much in the use case world at this point, right? I haven't done any user stories. Now I apply use case 2.0 and I decide what my slices are going to be, and I'm going to prioritize these slices. And when I do these slices, as Ian said earlier on, we have to have test cases that go with these slices. These become the acceptance criteria for my stories. Now, having done that, sorry, I clicked too soon, I can look at all this and I can derive, using 2.0, my user stories, derive from the use cases, the non-functional requirements, and the tests, and then I can add those user stories to determine which features I'm going to satisfy. So this is a way in which you can have your use cases, your use case framework, you can formally capture the requirements, but you're actually working and implementing in terms of user stories. So the slice gets written as a user story, as a so-and-so, I want to do so-and-so, so I can. The acceptance criteria is from the test cases, which you can actually write in Gherkin, because you know where in an activity diagram, you can do a given, I've done this, when I get to this decision, then these things need to happen. So the acceptance criteria becomes concrete and non-ambiguous. And so that's what we did. And that's, that's a working hypothesis for using both worlds. I shut up at that point.
That was great. And you really kept it to a couple of minutes. So kudos to you. Good. And, I'm sure people would love to get in touch with you afterwards if they have more questions or want to elaborate on that. But we've got a few minutes left, 6 or 7 minutes. I just want an opportunity to hand over to the audience to get you guys asking a couple questions. So please use the hand raising feature and I'll just call out some people if you have a question for any one of our panelists. I would encourage you to keep your question very brief so we can get through as many as possible. So no follow-ups, unfortunately, just a brief question, some quick fire Q&As. And Glenn, you have your hand up, so go for it, good sir.
Well, I was surprised to hear that user stories aren't requirements. And so I guess I've been using user stories as requirements and linking everything together. So I guess my question is, if use cases aren't requirements and stories aren't requirements, then what are requirements? I work at a bank, and so traceability is a necessity. And top to bottom traceability from requirement to what you actually did and the testing and validation. So I guess my question is, what happens to requirements? In what form are those now?
So I could answer that very quickly. Use cases and their associated narratives are a great way of capturing functional requirements. The problem is, a lot of what people put in their use cases aren't actually requirements, right? But it is a model of the intent of the requirements for the system, but you also need, and they give a great context for non-functional requirements as well. So that they can certainly play that role. But when you look at a lot of the examples on the internet, they're full of things that really aren't requirements.
But user stories are a promise to have a conversation about requirements. That's what's so nice about them. They frame the conversation. So there are still requirements to be captured. Mike could tell you exactly how it works.
Well, Glenn, I made that comment earlier. What I'm referring to there is I don't want to look at one sentence typed into Jira and say that's the requirement. That's exactly the start of the requirement. It's like the tip of the iceberg. I need that. I need the conversation. I need to know its acceptance criteria. I might even need to know the overall definition of done that the team is operating under. So that combined would make a requirement. But I wouldn't want to point to just one little sentence and say, there it is, that's a requirement, because it's too terse. Right. So it has to be augmented with conversations or a diagram or a use case, whatever that makes it more complete. One little sentence in Jira is not going to be enough to be a requirement. It's a pointer to the requirement.
Awesome. Thank you so much for clarifying that, guys. David, you have your hand up. Would you like to ask your question?
Oops. Hey, guys. This is actually a question to Bernie on your last example. Nice example, but I was wondering why you can't do that in parallel as you're creating stories. What I try and do is, epic stories, blah, blah, blah. At the epic level is capture that information together so you have the description that you're talking about, which is basically the high level overview of the system, and you may be building that system in parallel. So sure, I was wondering, when I saw yours, I have to say that horrible word, I felt like it's a bit waterfallish in that you're creating it up front. So go ahead and answer that.
Yeah, so I mean, when you're using Safe and you do an epic, you are going to do some analysis to see if that epic's going to survive, because the epic is really a backlog item. So yes, you're going to be doing upfront work to decide what's the scope of this thing, but you're not going to dive down into the details unless you might decide there's an architectural risk in that epic and you want to iron that out up front. You might do that. So it's not really waterfallish in that the epic and the features are an expression of desire and scope from an executive. Each of those things goes through a progressive backlog and further analysis. And when it comes to defining the use cases there, I did them all in one big lump, right? But you might just choose one and decide on one slice out of one use case, and you could explore that.
You just say one more thing. What about emergent design? I mean, that's coming from a story level, right?
Sure. So we've got it's interesting. I was thinking about this. There's emergent design and intentional design, right? Intentional architecture, emergent architecture. And I think, to be fair, there's intentional requirements and there's emergent requirements. You might be in a certain world of constraints where they're immutable. Those requirements are requirements. You can't change those things. So I think that's for another discussion, is emergent requirements and intentional requirements, because I think they're constraints, right? Intentional requirements are constraints.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thanks, David. Good question. Yeah.
And good answer. Okay, guys. let's wrap it up because we've overrun ever so slightly. I just wanted to thank Mike, Bernie, and Ian. Thank you so much for the super insightful conversation. Hopefully it has clarified for a lot of people. Yes, feel free to unmute though and help me clap.
Thanks for having us.
How's my meeting going?
Hey, Nabi.
Thank you.
It's so much
Nabi,
easier.
give me a few last words here.
Of course.
I must say that I sitting here wondering, is there anything I would like to comment on? And of course there were lots, but in general, I think it was just a fantastic presentation from all of you. And I want to say that there's no doubt for me that both use cases and user stories have a place in working with requirements and working with development in general. And it doesn't need to be so difficult, so complex. Use cases can be, I've been in discussions where we have created a use case model in a couple of hours. That actually has not been too bad. It has taken more time to really settle, but it can be quite easy. What I think would be fantastic is if we could do something which we all could agree on, both on use cases and on stories. So this is an invitation to all three of you. Why not do something for the world? Because we probably all agree this could be valuable to compose. But I don't want to do it. I don't want to do it in just our group. We shouldn't do work like that, in my opinion. So, having said that, there was once in the discussion a little history, and I thought it could be nice to finish with a little story. I remember I had Dave Thomas, my friend Dave Thomas from OTI, not pragmatic Dave Thomas, but OTI Dave Thomas. He was visiting me in Sweden. He was sitting out in my country house, drinking, eating, and had a very good time. And then he said to me, why do you write such a big book? And that was about my first book. Why do you write such a big book? I said, software engineering is a big subject. No, I think you should write a book about use cases and only about use cases and make it no more than 150 pages. I unfortunately didn't follow his advice. And I know now that that would have been a very good advice to follow. Anyway, that's why the first book became too thick. Okay. Thank you very much for me. And I really loved the discussion. Thank you so much.